Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Longevity Science. On today's video, we're going to discuss the relationship between aging and disease. And I think this is a topic that's really important to understand from the perspective of thinking about your own health and really the way that most physicians view health through the lens of individual diseases, typically considered in isolation. And this is true at the level of current clinical care. It's true in the way pharmaceutical companies think about developing therapeutics to improve health. And it's really true even all the way back to the level of basic biomedical research. Again, really, which is focused around thinking about health through the lens of individual diseases. This is a set of several of the major causes of death and disability in most developed nations. And one of the things that is a consequence of this disease-centric approach to health is that we tend to lose sight of the fact that really all of these functional declines and diseases have at their root a single greatest risk factor. And it's not the risk factors that you will typically hear about. It's not how much you eat or how much alcohol you consume or whether you exercise or whether you smoke. It's really how old you are. And this observation that age is the greatest risk factor for all of these functional declines and diseases suggests that there really may be a central root cause in the biology of aging that is contributing to the increased risk of onset and progression as we get older. And so one of the implications of that is that if we can understand the biology of aging, then we have the opportunity to actually target that biology therapeutically to delay the onset and progression of all of these functional declines and diseases simultaneously. And again, that's very different from the what I would call 20th century approach to medicine, which is typically waiting until people are sick and then trying to cure their disease. In reality, really more often treating the symptoms, compared to what I expect will become 21st century medicine, which is really keeping people healthy proactively, at least in large part by targeting the biology of aging. So that's kind of the big picture. And this phrase 21st century medicine, you'll hear me use frequently, again, to refer to the idea that we really want to be taking a proactive approach to health, keeping people healthy by preventing them from developing these functional declines and diseases that go along with old age. And again, one important part of that, maybe the most important part of that, is to directly target the biology of aging through a variety of different approaches that we'll cover in great depth on this YouTube channel in future episodes. So I just finished telling you that age is the greatest risk factor for all of these diseases, and I'm sure that you probably believe me, but in case you don't, I think it's useful to actually look at the data. And this is a theme that I'll come back to over and over and over again in these videos, is you should be somewhat skeptical when people make claims and want to see some data to actually back those claims up. So I made the claim that age is the greatest risk factor for most of the major functional declines and diseases in developed countries. Now I'm going to show you some data to actually back that up. So what's shown here are 4 of the top 10 killers in the United States. So heart disease and cancer have been number 1 and number 2 respectively for really the past 50 years. In 2022, COVID-19 was the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States, at least according to the CDC. And Alzheimer's disease was a little bit further down the list, but it's still in the top 10. So these are 4 of the top 10 killers. And, really that's true not just in the United States, but in pretty much every developed country around the world. So what's shown here are some of the common risk factors that your physician is likely to talk to you about when you go in for your annual exam. Things like alcohol consumption and whether or not you smoke and obesity and high blood pressure. And all of these are important risk factors. And I certainly do not want to minimize the importance of getting these risk factors under control. But I think it's useful to note that these all increase or affect your risk of developing these diseases really by a factor of about 2-fold. So somewhere between a 2 to 4-fold increase in risk, depending on how many of these risk factors you have. And if your physician is sophisticated, they may talk to you about genetics. So in the case of Alzheimer's disease, what's shown here is the greatest common genetic risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease, which is ApoE. So if you have two ApoE4 alleles, that puts you in the highest risk group genetically for developing Alzheimer's disease. And that turns out to be somewhere between about a 4 and 8-fold increase in risk. So again, just trying to get a feel for magnitude of risk associated with these risk factors. Okay, so now what I'm going to show you in the next graphic is exactly the same data, but alongside of it is going to be the increase in risk associated with 4 decades of biological aging. So going from, say, age 45 to age 85. And it's pretty striking. So the data from the last graphic is still there. It's just completely dwarfed by the impact of 4 decades of biological aging. And so again, I think a couple things to appreciate, right? Age is a really big risk factor for these and other major causes of death and disability, and it's not even close. We're talking an order of magnitude or more difference between 4 decades of biological aging and all of the other risk factors, perhaps even all of the other risk factors combined. So age really is the greatest risk factor for most of the functional declines and diseases that afflict people in developed countries. So we can then ask the question, given that, what would the relative impact be from 20th century approaches targeting individual diseases in isolation versus 21st century approaches targeting the biology of aging? And one way to do this is to look at life expectancy. And so this is work that was originally done by a demographer named J.L. Shansky. Other people have since done similar types of analyses. And the question posed here is, what would the impact be on life expectancy for a typical 50-year-old woman if we could cure individual age-related diseases versus targeting the biology of aging? And so let's start with the diseases. And what's shown here is the impact for the 2 biggest killers. Again, heart disease is number 1, cancer is number 2. So if we could cure all forms of cancer today, we had a magic pill that did that, the impact on life expectancy for a typical 50-year-old woman in the United States is about 3 years. I don't know if you think that's a big number or a small number. When the first time I saw that data, I was pretty shocked. I anticipated that the effect of curing cancer, winning the war on cancer, would be larger than just 3 years of average life expectancy. The same thing's true for heart disease. If we could cure all forms of heart disease, you get about the same impact on life expectancy for a typical 50-year-old woman. If you cure both, it gets a little better. You get about 7 years. And I think when you stop and think about this for a minute, the reason for what I would argue is a relatively smaller effect on life expectancy than one might anticipate is because you've only fixed one thing or 2 things. You haven't fixed all of the other functional declines and diseases of old age, like Alzheimer's disease, kidney disease, liver failure, susceptibility to infectious disease, and the list goes on and on. So even if you fix cancer and heart disease, you still have all of these other things that can kill you that continue to increase exponentially as you get older. And I do want to make the point here, I am not at all trying to minimize the importance of curing individuals' diseases, right? If a loved one, a parent or a spouse or a child has cancer, you want that cancer cured. That's immensely important at the individual level. But what's useful to understand is that at the population level, the emphasis on trying to cure individual disease really has a much smaller impact than I think most people would expect. I would also say that we have been largely unsuccessful at curing age-related diseases at the population level. I mentioned that cancer and heart disease were the top 2 killers in the United States, and that they have been for the past 50 years. We've had a war on cancer for the past 50 years, and while great strides have been made in many cases, they're still the top 2 killers. So I think we can ask the question, really how successful have we been in this emphasis on trying to cure disease as opposed to preventing disease in the first place, which I would argue from a biological perspective is probably easier. So now let's shift gears and look at what the impact could be from targeting the biology of aging to modify disease. And obviously, it's speculative at this point to say that we can do this in people. We haven't proven that this is feasible in humans yet, but it's pretty routine in laboratory animals. And I'll give you a specific example of that in a few minutes. So if we take what is now pretty routine in laboratory animals and we just extrapolate that to humans, we can ask, what would the effect be from targeting the biology of aging? And it turns out that proportionally, it's a much larger effect. That's not too surprising, right? Again, we've not only modified risk of cancer and heart disease, we've modified risk of many, maybe all of the functional declines and diseases of aging at the same time. So for that same 50-year-old woman, you get about 2 to 3 decades of additional life, with the added bonus that those years are predicted to be spent in relatively good health, free from chronic disease and disability. Again, because we haven't only impacted one thing, we've impacted all of them at the same time. So that's this idea of expanding health span at the same time that we're increasing lifespan. Okay, so hopefully you can appreciate, at least from a conceptual perspective, targeting the biology of aging, 21st century medicine is a much more efficient and effective approach than targeting individual diseases in isolation. And so now I just want to finish up by giving you an example. So I've made the claim, right, that this is routine in laboratory animals. And again, data is important. And so I'm going to actually give you a specific example backed up by literally dozens, if not hundreds, of peer-reviewed scientific papers. And that example is the drug rapamycin. So we're going to have a lot more on rapamycin in future episodes, and so I'm not going to go way into the weeds here, but I just want to give you sort of an overview of what we know about rapamycin right now and its impact on the biology of aging. So rapamycin, first of all, is a very cool molecule. It was originally discovered on Easter Island, also called Rapa Nui. That's where the drug gets its name. And it's currently the best-in-class longevity drug that we know about today. And that's really, again, based on studies from a whole variety of different laboratory animals. Every organism in the laboratory where rapamycin has been tested, it's been shown to increase lifespan and delay pretty much all of the functional declines and diseases that go along with aging. This has been most studied in mice who age about 30 times more rapidly than people from a biological perspective. They get most of the same age-related functional declines and diseases that people do. So they're a really good model for studying aging from that perspective. A typical mouse in the laboratory will live about 3 years. And what we know is that rapamycin in mice can increase lifespan up to about 30%. We actually don't know really what the biggest effect possible is because nobody's done a full dose response, but it seems like around 30% is pretty reasonable to expect for a percent increase in lifespan that's possible with rapamycin. Might be possible to do a little bit better. One of the important things about rapamycin from laboratory studies in mice is we know that you don't actually have to start the treatment at a young age. You can actually start treating the mice right around the biological equivalent of, say, a 60 to 65-year-old person, still get most of the benefits in terms of lifespan, and also in terms of a bunch of different age-related functional declines and diseases that really span most of the tissues and organs in the body. And so a subset of those where we know rapamycin is particularly effective is shown it right in this graphic, and it includes, most of the important ones that we would think about: brain, heart, kidney, muscle, immune system. Another thing that's really cool about rapamycin is, in at least some cases, short-term treatments starting in middle age are enough to actually reverse some of the functional declines that go along with aging. So I'm really not a fan of the term reversing aging. I think that gets misused. But in the case of rapamycin, it is fair to say that we can see functional changes in things like the heart that decline in function with age. And within about 4 to 10 weeks of treatment with rapamycin, we can actually see some of those functional declines improve. So the heart seems to be functioning, beating, pumping blood more like a youthful heart. And so that's pretty exciting. And that's been best documented in 4 places: in the heart, the immune system, the female ovaries, which is really interesting, and the oral cavity. So work from my lab at the University of Washington showed that mice get periodontal disease as they age, and that within about 8 to 10 weeks of starting treatment with rapamycin in old mice, we can actually reverse the clinically defining features of periodontal disease. And so again, we'll go into more detail on some of the science here in future episodes, but I really just wanted to give you a feel for the fact that rapamycin treatment in mice really is well established, has a pretty large effect size, and isn't limited to only one disease of aging or lifespan. It really seems to modify many of the functional declines and diseases that go along with old age. And so I want to just finish up by showing you a little bit of real data. So this is data from a paper that my lab published back in 2016. And here we were really asking that very simple question I posed earlier, which is, what would the impact be on life expectancy from modifying the biology of aging? So in this particular experiment, we took mice that were between 20 and 21 months of age. That's again about the mouse equivalent biologically of a 60 to 65-year-old person. At that age, we started treatment with either a vehicle, so that's like the equivalent of a placebo, or rapamycin. And we only treated them for 3 months. And then we stopped the treatment, and then we just put the animals back on the shelf in their cages and let them live out the rest of their natural lives. And so the question was, would this short treatment with rapamycin have any effect on future life expectancy compared to the mice that got the vehicle or the placebo? And the result of that experiment is shown here in this survival curve. And so again, you're going to see a lot of survival curves if you keep watching the content on this channel. So what's shown here are the percent of the animals that are still alive as a function of time after the end of that treatment period. So again, the 0 here on the x-axis is about 23 to 24 months of age for the mice. So at that point, they're 65 to 70 years old biologically. And again, the only difference between the two groups was that the vehicle group didn't get any treatment. They just got a blank, a placebo. And the red line, the rapamycin treated group, got rapamycin for 3 months. And what you can see is that rapamycin for 3 months increased remaining life expectancy by about 60% in this particular cohort. We tested a couple of different doses. We looked in males and females. This, it turns out, is the male mice treated with the highest dose of rapamycin. So pretty significant impact on remaining life expectancy from targeting the biology of aging with rapamycin. And obviously we don't know yet whether this would work the same way outside of the laboratory, and if it did, whether the magnitude of effect would be similar. But if we just assume for a minute that it would be, that would equate to about 2 to 3 years for a typical 7-year-old dog, or about 2 decades for that 50-year-old woman that I alluded to earlier. So again, you can appreciate that if it turns out that we can modify the biology of aging with rapamycin in people, the potential impact, again, is much more substantial than trying to cure all cancers or cure all heart diseases in people who are already sick. Okay, so why should you care, right? Why does this matter to you? I think, first of all, it's really important to appreciate that health is really your greatest asset. If you don't have your health, nothing else in life is as good. And it's a very different life developing something like diabetes or heart disease or emphysema in your 40s, as opposed to living to your 70s or 80s free from any chronic disease. I think it's also important to be honest with ourselves. And 20th century medicine has done a good job at keeping people sick. There are a lot more people living longer with one or more age-related diseases. And that's important, sure, absolutely. If you have an age-related disease, keeping you alive is important. But wouldn't it be better to keep you alive without any age-related diseases? I also think it's important to be honest with ourselves that 20th century medicine appears to be unsustainable. And again, we'll get a little bit more into the details here in future episodes, but you should appreciate that right now, estimates put up to about 90% of healthcare expenditures going towards treating people with chronic age-related diseases. And that number is increasing. And I don't know when the system breaks. Is it 92% or 94% or 96%? But that's not sustainable all the way up to 100%. And so we really have to do something. And I believe that a proactive, science-based approach to keeping people healthy, 21st century medicine, is an important part of ensuring the sustainability of our healthcare system in the future. So 20th century medicine really offers a path, we believe, to keeping you healthy and potentially a path to saving our healthcare system. And then I'll just finish up by saying that I believe we know enough today to increase healthy longevity, by 10 to 20 years for many people. And we'll get into more details of exactly what I mean by that in future episodes, but that's really the premise of Optispan, is that we have the opportunity to help people recover their lost decades. And I think it's important to be optimistic that progress in the field of longevity will enable us to do even better tomorrow.